Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the channel if you're new. Welcome back if you aren't. I'm EDJ, and we are continuing with Historia Civilis's series on Julius Caesar. We are now in episode 2, which is Caesar versus the Helvetii. And for once, I feel confident about my pronunciation. Watch it be wrong. So yeah, last time we saw the rise of Julius Caesar and, his many reforms, and now, I don't know what the heck to expect from this specifically, but, I guess we'll find out, right? If you want to watch the original video without me talking, my face here, whenever I pause to comment and just say stuff, the link is down in the description down below. Without any further ado, let's just get right into it. Let's watch Caesar versus the Helvetii. 58 B.C.E. Wait. Alright, much better.
Remember back to Caesar's year as consul, when there had been a coordinated effort to sabotage his career by assigning him to govern the woodland and country lanes of Italy. After achieving dominance over the Senate, he had replaced this dead-end job with the governorship of two provinces, Illyricum and Cisalpine Gaul. Governing two provinces at once was unusual, but not unprecedented. Then, when the governor of neighboring Transalpine Gaul unexpectedly died, he had that province assigned to himself as well. By the way, for the sake of simplicity, I keep on using the word governor, but the Romans used the words proconsul and propraetor, which doesn't exactly mean the same thing. Basically, if the Senate took a former consul and put them in charge of a province or at the head of an army, they were now a proconsul, which legally granted them some of the old command authority that they used to possess when they were in office. Command authority, the Romans had their own word for this too, imperium. A person with imperium was authorized to channel the power and authority of the state in order to enact their will. So governors, generals, judges, and high-ranking politicians literally embodied the Roman state. Diplomats also had imperium. There are famous stories about the over-the-top arrogance of Roman diplomats, talking down their noses at foreign kings. But look at it from their point of view. If Roman diplomats thought that they were the embodiment of the Roman state, it would be inappropriate for them to bow to a foreign king.
Okay, yeah, I've heard about the famous Roman diplomacy where they just kind of go up and act like they're your boss. But yeah, that puts it, I like this because it puts it into a different perspective. Yeah, if they're embodying, I guess, the Roman power, why would you want to look weak, right? Like, usually when we think of, like, diplomacy, we think you need to kind of be kinder, more, I guess, willing to compromise, not walking up and being rude to people. But it makes sense, Rome was a little different, and hey, they lasted as long as they did, so maybe they were onto something, right?
It's easy to see why the Romans were awful diplomats. Another thing to keep in mind going forward, a person with imperium was immune from legal prosecution. You could always charge them later as a private citizen, but not while they had imperium. So, on January 1st of 58 BCE, Caesar became the proconsul in charge of Illyricum, Cisalpine Gaul, and Transalpine Gaul for a 5-year term. These three provinces had a total of 4 legions assigned to them, which at full strength would have been around 20,000 men.
Which is insane that Caesar managed to get that power. Like I said, Julius Caesar, as we witnessed last video, politically was, great, and as we know, in a military sense, also great. But man, did he also have luck, because that last dude who died, and he just took this, and yeah, this is where I guess he's setting up the Gallic Wars, where, it began under the pretense of one of Rome's allies was being invaded by, a migrating tribe. I forgot which group specifically that tribe was, but point is, and, they asked for help from Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar pounced upon that opportunity and went to battle. So yeah, very opportunistic, but also he could defend himself, right? Like, oh, I was helping an ally. You can't blame me for that.
Caesar immediately began raising 2 more legions at his personal expense, bringing his total up to 6 legions and 30,000 men. Last year, when Caesar had secured new provinces, he had also given himself the power to appoint his own legates, which was usually the Senate's job. Just a reminder, a legate was the person in charge of each legion, so in this case he had 6 jobs to fill. He gave one of these positions to a man named Labienus. Caesar and Labienus were the same age, and they had become good friends during the Catiline conspiracy, when Caesar had served as praetor and Labienus had been a tribune of the plebs. During Caesar's year as consul, Labienus had served with him as praetor. This made Labienus eligible for a province of his own, but instead he chose to come with Caesar and serve as his right-hand man. Later, when Caesar would get distracted by the day-to-day governance of the provinces, Labienus would be left in charge of the army. When circumstance required Caesar's presence elsewhere, Labienus would govern the provinces in his place. When Caesar's final term as governor ended, he would have Labienus appointed his successor. Near the beginning of the year, Caesar received word that a large tribe, the Helvetii, had up.
It's interesting to learn about Labienus. Like I said, I've never heard of Labienus before, but him playing the role of Julius Caesar's right-hand man is interesting. Like, so I didn't know who this guy was, and now, yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning more about these many, new characters, I suppose, right? Because usually you usually hear about Mark Antony, and he almost comes across as Julius Caesar's, like, right-hand man, so, I don't know. We'll get to Antony sooner or later, I'm sure.
Uprooted and were migrating west. On their current trajectory, they were going to cut through Transalpine Gaul. Caesar ordered his legions to mobilize, and to travel to the edge of Roman territory near modern Geneva. There he had them break down a bridge over a river that the Helvetii would need to cross. When the Helvetii realized that there were 6 legions standing in their path, they formally requested passage through Roman territory.
Yeah, we covered this with the Kings and Generals episode, but yeah, essentially Julius Caesar plays the, you know, he acts like he's actually gonna listen to them, like, oh, you know, let me consider this. In reality, he was just building fortifications, and, you know, he never had the intention of letting these guys pass, which is hilarious.
Caesar sent a response, saying something along the lines of, "Wait there, I'll think about it." A week passed in silence. Finally, Caesar sent a messenger denying their request, at which time they discovered that the Romans had secretly constructed a 28-kilometer line of defenses in front of the river. What was Caesar doing here? If you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, you can. He would argue that the Romans were allied with many of the Gallic tribes in the area, and they didn't want 300,000 militaristic Helvetii moving into their territory and upsetting the delicate balance of power. But in my opinion, Caesar wasn't acting in good faith here. He had started mustering extra legions before the Helvetii had even entered the picture. If you ask me, this had more to do with Caesar settling his debts than it did with maintaining the status quo. The Helvetii were upset by Caesar's refusal.
Yeah, Kings and Generals mentioned that Julius Caesar needed money, so going to war was in his best interest, and yeah, obviously, I think Julius Caesar wasn't in it just to protect his allies. He had personal gain to gain by, you know, kind of starting a conflict with the Helvetii and fighting already, you know? I mean, he was raising up these legions, yeah, he intended to use them, obviously. So yeah, it's interesting to hear Historius Civilis put in his own opinion, I guess his own bias, because, you know, like, I know this is one of his older videos, 7 years ago, and yeah, I remember when I was kind of researching this, that he does interject his opinions in this series of Julius Caesar, and they're not always the kindest. And yeah, I personally don't fully mind, you know, if, you know, creator puts in their own bias. I even heard, like, I think someone commented that even Epic History TV's Napoleon series, there is some bias, because I believe Epic History TV is British or from the UK, or I think that's what the comment said. So yeah, there's always a bit of bias, right? And I feel like with a man like Julius Caesar, there is a lot of discussion that can be had in regards to who he was, his intentions. Like I said, I personally find the man an enigma. you could debate about him all day. Some would say he's a hero, some would say he's a villain, some would say he's a tyrant, some would say he's saving the Republic, Rome, or, there's a lot. And, I think that one of the points is, before he died, he had rejected kingship from Rome, and, I believe he was dictator for life, yet I still think he was more than willing to take power for the rest of his life. So I believe the rejection of the title of king was more of a pragmatic thing about Julius Caesar, just to not upset anyone, but he still would have pretty much been the sole ruler or force of Rome. At least that's what I think. Obviously, he died before he enacted any of his long-term plans, but that's something I think, and obviously some people would probably think, well, when you're actually wrong, or maybe some would agree. Like, that's what I mean. There's a lot about Caesar's intentions, what he wanted to accomplish, and yeah, like I said, he's very interesting. I think more so than a Napoleon or even Alexander the Great, in terms of trying to figure out what he is. Like I said, there's a lot of discussion about if he's a villain or a hero, and a lot of people seem really divided when it comes to Julius Caesar, and I have my own feelings and opinions, obviously. They may come out throughout the series, and they'll probably be formed as I watch these videos, shift and change and whatnot. So, yeah, let's just get back to the video.
Some of them were like, to hell with this, and decided to independently cross the river anyways. Caesar had anticipated this. He didn't have enough men to defend the entire 28-kilometer line at once, but wherever a group of Helvetii tried to push, Caesar and his men converged on that location. The Helvetii made several attempts over several days, but Caesar repulsed them every time. The Helvetii were beaten, and decided to go around Roman territory by marching north. Before too long, some of Rome's Gallic allies started to get word of a massive Helvetii migration coming their way, and sent panicked messages to Caesar asking for assistance. With this thin justification, Caesar set off in pursuit of the Helvetii, and caught up with them.
Yeah, Julius Caesar and his exploits in Gaul, I believe, were regarded by the Senate, at least some, as illegal or unjust war that he committed. And yes, this whole "I'm protecting our allies" thing, obviously Julius Caesar could use to defend himself. I just remember like the HBO Rome series where they called Julius Caesar's like war illegal, or like there were some who were not for it. Obviously, Julius Caesar probably would have either upset the allies or anything, but I do believe there was a lot of personal gain that he wanted, so that he would benefit from by doing what he did. So yeah, I think Julius Caesar is a very pragmatic man, a very practical one, who at the end, I wouldn't call like selfish. That's not the word. Or obviously there's a bit of self-interest in his motives, I believe. As for why, whether it be altruistic, like saving the Republic, or for personal glory, again, I don't fully know. Maybe a combination of a lot of things, but yeah, like I said, the man to me is an enigma, so it's hard for me to just say anything definitively about him, like I could with Alexander the Great or even a Napoleon. Like, Julius Caesar's a hard guy to pin down, I feel.
Them at the Arar River, which we now call the Saône. The Helvetii were having difficulty with the river, and a simple crossing had dragged on for weeks. Caesar launched a surprise nighttime attack, but due to low visibility and general confusion, he was not very successful.
Yeah, this is my favorite part, where they took them like a long time to get across this river. Julius Caesar does it literally just one day, which is hilarious.
And most of the Helvetii on his side of the river were able to retreat safely into the woods. The next morning, Caesar and his men started construction on a bridge across the river. They were finished within hours, and the next day Caesar and his 6 legions had crossed the river, and they were on to tracking the rest of the Helvetii. When Caesar caught up with them, the Helvetii sent a diplomat to meet with him. They didn't really accomplish anything, they just ended up airing grievances at each other. It now seemed pretty clear that there was going to be a battle. Caesar assembled his legions and sent his 4,000 cavalry forward to screen his infantry as they advanced. The cavalry walked right into an ambush. The ambush was small in scale, but the Romans still took heavy losses and were routed. This was Caesar's first proper military encounter in Gaul, and it ended in defeat. But it could have been a lot worse. At least the cavalry took the brunt of the attack, and were able to disengage when they were beaten. If the infantry had walked into this, it could have gone a lot differently. After this, Caesar must have felt humbled, because he moved much more cautiously. The Helvetii continued their migration north, and Caesar shadowed them the entire way. Whenever they stopped moving, the Helvetii would deploy for battle, but Caesar never took the bait. This went on for several days. One day, the Helvetii ended their march in front of a steep hill. Caesar pulled Labienus aside, and together they hatched a plan. In the middle of the night, Labienus was to march off with 2 of Caesar's most experienced legions. The plan was for Labienus to march all the way around the Helvetii position in the dark, and take the hill behind them before the sun came up. At dawn, Caesar would march out and deploy for battle. Labienus was to hold his position until the moment he saw Caesar's forces come into contact with the Helvetii. When that happened, he was to charge downhill and hit them in the rear. A key ingredient to this plan was trusting that the Helvetii wouldn't be stupid enough to attack uphill, even though they would outnumber Labienus' detachment 7 or 8 to 1. If they did attack uphill, that would screw up the plan a little bit, but all Labienus would need to do was hold off the Helvetii until Caesar could come to the rescue. That's why he had the 2 most experienced legions with him. So, in the middle of the night, Labienus marched off with his legions, and at dawn, Caesar and the remaining 4 legions marched out of their fortified encampment to meet the Helvetii, making...
Yeah, I really like this plan. We know Julius Caesar does win, which is, you know, kind of the benefit of hindsight, right? But, yeah, it still is interesting to learn just how he wins, you know?
Making as much commotion as possible. He sent his cavalry to scout ahead. Before long, his scouts came back, with reports that there were Helvetii all over the hillside, and Labienus was nowhere to be found. This was bad. Caesar abruptly threw his legions into a defensive line. Then he sent out all of his scouts with very simple orders. Find out what happened to Labienus' legions. They stayed deployed like this all day, prepared for an overwhelming attack, but it never came. Finally, the scouts came back. Labienus had been waiting on the hill the entire time. The first report had been wrong. The Helvetii had been completely unaware that anything was going on.
Dang.
Caesar must have been pretty angry because when he was writing his account of this incident 12 years later, he names names and throws the scouts responsible under the bus.
Idiots. You know, it is interesting. Yeah, Julius Caesar did write a novel, a book of his tellings of, like, his exploits and whatnot. I think also Gaul. And, you know, it is something I've read some small excerpts on, not too much. I haven't read the entire account, mind you. But it is cool that we just have writings from the man himself. Even Napoleon's memoirs, like, it is cool. Like, I was listening to some of Napoleon's memoirs, and it is interesting, you know. Then again, you know, there is room for, like, I guess, certain embellishment, I believe is the proper term, or, you know, exaggeration, obviously, because I think when people write about themselves, I think they're more willing to leave out some things. Not that I'm saying this is Julius Caesar's fault, mind you, I just mean, obviously take into account sometimes, right, like, some people would probably want to leave out a bit of their own flaws or failures. Again, I don't know, but yeah, it is interesting still to, like, see those, like, sources, you know?
By this point, it was near dusk, so Caesar sent a messenger to Labienus, telling him to abandon the plan and come back to camp. The next day, Caesar finally had to deal with the fact that his army was down to 2 more days of food. Some of his Gallic allies had been promising a food shipment for a while now, but these were Gauls of questionable loyalty, and so far none had arrived. But there was an allied Gallic outpost nearby, and if the Romans left first thing in the morning, they could make it there by sundown. That was the new plan. Caesar would get the food himself, and then he would continue to shadow the Helvetii. The Romans marched away, but unbeknownst to Caesar, it was his turn to be shadowed.
I'm a guy.
How the tables turn. or how to turn tables.
And my dignity. As if watching my team lose wasn't punishment.
Caesar had just begun his forced march to resupply when all of a sudden he had Helvetii attacking the rear of his column. He didn't see this one coming. The infantry at the rear of the column turned to fight, and Caesar ordered all of his cavalry to go and help them. There was a small hill nearby, so he repositioned the rest of his infantry there and had them deploy for battle. This may have taken several hours, especially since Caesar had 10,000 raw recruits under his command. He put his 4 experienced legions up at the front, and his 2 inexperienced ones in reserve. When the infantry was finally in position, a signal was given, and the Romans who had been holding the Helvetii off fell back to the Roman line. The Helvetii advanced.
Yeah, Romans' discipline and organization is amazing. It might, like, there's a reason they were, like, you know, the masters of the world for such a long time, right? That they lasted as long as they did. It is amazing. And yeah, this is the first time I'm watching a Historia Civilis telling of a battle, you know, because we've covered Kings and Generals, we've covered Epic History TV, but I also like this too, because we did cover this encounter with the Kings and Generals first episode of Julius Caesar. So yeah, there is details he adds in that Kings and Generals didn't, which makes this still really interesting, even though we know, like I said, we know what happens. Yeah, I think this is really good. I like his take, you know, how he portrays battles and the info he gives in battles.
Slowly up the hill, and the Romans held their ground. When they were in range, the 4 legions at the front threw their javelins, and sent their first 2 lines charging down the hill. The fighting was evenly matched for some time, but the Romans held the high ground, and the Helvetii gradually started to be pushed down the hill. Suddenly, a third army entered the battlefield. 2 local Gallic tribes had allied themselves with the Helvetii. They had been sluggish in their pursuit of the Romans, but all 15,000 of them arrived with the battle already in progress. In this period, it was very common for armies to commit most of their men in the first wave, in the hopes that their overwhelming numbers would cause a rout. The Romans were weirdos, and their system kept a large percentage of their army in reserve, but it was designed for moments like this. The Roman third line was a cross-section of the most experienced soldiers under Caesar's command. There were, at most, 6,500 of them, but probably less. And when they moved up, they stopped the 15,000 Helvetii reinforcements in their tracks.
Yeah, I guess it's just quality over quantity, right? Like, yeah, I think we also saw with, like, the later Roman Empire, even when, like, outnumbered, they could just win great battles. Like I said, it's just their skill, organization, discipline, adaptability, mobility is just... Rome was a force to be reckoned with. Like, man, they are one of the greatest, like, forces of all time, you know, in human history.
Neither side had a clear advantage, and the battle dragged on all day. Caesar held his raw recruits back. It wasn't clear that they were capable of holding their own against the Helvetii, and Caesar didn't want to risk it. The Romans kept on making incremental progress here and there, but it was exhausting work, and both sides were taking heavy losses. The sun went down and they were still fighting. Eventually, the Helvetii had been reduced by an astonishing 2/3, and they pulled back, dejected and thoroughly beaten. The Romans were totally exhausted, even in victory. They had lost 5,000 men, which was a quarter of their most experienced soldiers.
Yeah, but the Helvetii lost, like, what, 60,000? Like, way more. It's insane.
Caesar's army was truly shaken, and it took them a full 3 days to recover and tend to their wounded. They had captured some Helvetii supply wagons, so their food problem was now taken care of. Once the Romans were well enough to be on the march again, they were immediately met with a Helvetii delegation offering terms of surrender. Caesar accepted. He had the Helvetii hand over all of their weapons, allowed them to leave Gaul with their lives and go home, on the condition that in the future they would provide fighting men to the Roman Republic upon request. They agreed. This was the beginning of the so-called Gallic Wars, a series of campaigns that began here in 58 BCE and ended in 51 BCE, just after the Battle of Alesia. Campaigns that began ostensibly to stabilize neighboring Gaul by restricting the movement of people, ended with its subjugation.
Yeah, like, saying Julius Caesar took advantage, man. It's amazing. Just, hey, help us. Well, I'm gonna take it all instead. You know? Yeah, so that was the first time I saw Historia Civilis, you know, telling of a battle, and it was really great. I really liked it. Very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more. I don't really have much else to add other than I'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.